start, Julia.
Thank you. So I think we have everybody coming in. I know that we have a large number of people online. So welcome everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending what time zone that you're in. And very warm welcome to our webinar today. My name's Julia Nielsen. I'm the Deputy Director of the OECD Trade and Agricultural Directorate, and it's my great pleasure to open this webinar this morning. Now, before we get started, just to remind everybody that the meeting is being recorded, and you will have seen that as you joined. The webinar is also being live streamed on YouTube, as well as available in our Zoom room, which has a maximum capacity of a number of attendees. And it looks like we have a large number of registrations, so we wanted to make this as available as possible. So look, with that, let me thank you all for joining today's discussion. And I'm really delighted to be opening the webinar for our new report, which is entitled Beyond Food Loss and Waste Reduction Targets, Translating Reduction Ambition into Policy Outcomes. So this report really adds quite a significant understanding to an issue that has been into the international spotlight for over a decade now. And I think the attention really started in around 2011 when the FAO published estimates that about 30% of all food produced is either lost or wasted. And I think that was a figure that struck and shocked everybody on a kind of visceral level. But now we know that not only is it a problem as we think about that terrible waste, but we also know that reducing food loss and waste is a critical part of the solution to the triple challenge facing food systems. And that's the triple challenge of feeding a growing world population with affordable, nutritious food, ensuring the livelihoods of people all along the food chain, and delivering on climate and sustainability commitments and reducing the sustainability footprint of the sector. So food loss and waste is central to that. Our agricultural outlook that we do every year with FAO and the 2024 agricultural outlook estimated that to achieve SDG 12.3, which is the one where we halve food waste and decrease food loss, that if that was achieved, that could raise 153 million people out of hunger and reduce agricultural emissions by 4% by 2030. So that's a very concrete contribution from this area. But in order to meet SDG 12.3 on food loss and waste, countries actually have to move the needle and they have to implement more ambitious food loss and waste policies and enhance their existing commitments. So we need to go beyond what we're doing now. And this is what's important about this new report. It actually provides the first ever evidence base of what countries are actually doing now to reduce food loss and waste. And it offers some pathways for policy improvements in order to meet food loss and waste reduction targets. And this is really one of the things that we try to do at the OECD is bring the knowledge of different economies together and help policymakers learn from each other and learn some good and best practices. So I'm particularly grateful to my colleague Celine Ginet, who led this work, and I know that she's been deeply dedicated to it. And I have seen enough of the emails in the lead up to the event today to know just how much work that is, and also to all the other colleagues who've contributed today. And we're also very grateful for the collaboration that we've enjoyed with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So with that, I also have the pleasure of welcoming Cecile Haferkamp, who is the director at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network for the Food, Environment, Land and Development Programme. And Cecile is going to moderate the roundtable discussion at the end of the session today. But most importantly, this work would not be a success without the involvement of the experts and the government officials in the 42 countries that participated in the survey and the follow-up discussions to actually provide the basis for this mutual learning. Today's webinar, we're going to zoom in on a few of those economies, and we're going to focus on the lessons and the insights from France, Australia and Japan in terms of their innovative policy strategies that they have used for food loss and waste, and the new ways they have found to monitor progress towards SDG 12.3. So with that, let me thank all our panelists who are joining to discuss this important topic. And I look forward to what is, I'm sure, going to be a very lively and informative discussion. So with that, let me pass over to Celine.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Céline Giner. I'm a policy analyst working on food systems at the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate. And I lead the work on food loss and waste policies at the OECD. And I'm very pleased to see so many of you connected today. What we want to do today is to share the key insights from a project that started in 2023 and that aimed at better understanding the food loss and waste international policy environment. I want to thank all of my colleagues at the OECD and at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network who contributed to this work, and most of them participate today in this virtual event here around the table. So let's move to the first slide. Next, yeah. Let me first start with a bit of information on the OECD. We are an international organization based in Paris with 38 member states and about 3,000 employees. Most of them are policy analysts like myself. We're working on the full range of social, economic, and environmental challenges, including food systems. And how do we work? Well, we try to inform and advise by providing a unique source of data, analysis, and insights. We engage and influence. We bring policymakers and experts together to exchange ideas. That's what we're doing today. And we set standards and provide policy support. Next. We've organized this event to present the key findings of our original comprehensive review of the international food loss and waste policy environment. Our OECD report beyond food loss and waste reduction targets, translating reduction ambitions into policy outcomes, was released last week. It looks at the food loss and waste policy environment along the different stages of the agro-food supply chain, from agricultural productions to households. It has an international scope with 42 information on 42 countries, among them 34 of the 38 OECD countries and 6 accession countries. We have also developed in-depth information on the policy environment in 3 case study countries, Australia, France, and Japan. How did we work? Well, we used a questionnaire and then exchange with policymakers and experts in the different countries. We're very pleased to have the experts from Australia, France, and Japan joining us today in this webinar to highlight the very innovative food loss and waste policy strategies. And I want to thank all the experts and policymakers who contributed to this work and to make it possible. Why did we undertake this review on the food loss and waste policy environment? Well, first we were asked to do so by OECD Ministers of Agriculture. Indeed, in November 2022, the OECD Ministers of Agriculture called on the OECD to support their work to strengthen the sustainability of food systems by developing data and policy insights on food loss and waste reduction. Well, the fact that food loss and waste is an international priority is not new. For over a decade now, food loss and waste has gained strong international attention. In 2021, the FAO published estimates that about 30% of all food produced is either lost or wasted. And in 2015, the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, were set up. SDG target 12.3 state that by 2030, per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels should be halved, and food losses along production and supply chain should be reduced. We looked at the alignment of the national food loss and waste targets with the SDG 12.3, and we found that 74% of the countries have a target that can be compared somehow to the SDG target 12.3. About a fourth of the countries have targets that are fully aligned with the SDG target, and another fourth of the countries, they have targets that are even more ambitious. So why is food loss and waste reduction needed? Reducing food loss and waste, as stated by Julia, is a critical part of the global solution to the triple challenge of feeding a growing world population, ensuring the livelihoods of households along the agro-food supply chain, and delivering on climate and sustainability commitments. This was underlined in our report that was published in 2021, Making Better Policies for Food Systems. We undertook some analysis together with the FAO that was published in the OECD FAO 2024 Agricultural Outlook. And we look at what achieving 12.3 would bring. Well, we found that it could help reducing agricultural greenhouse gas emissions by 4% and raise 153 million people out of hunger. So it's worth trying to achieve SDG 12.3. So let me provide some insight on the food loss and waste policy environment. The SDG framework has strongly influenced the development of national food loss and waste strategies. This is the first key insight. Before 2015, only 16% of the countries had a food loss and waste strategies. At present, 80% of the countries have a food loss and waste strategy. So policy action has accelerated, and it has accelerated even further recently, with many strategies being developed and implemented in 2020 and after. Most of the strategies have a 2030 horizon, so the SDG horizon, so showing countries' commitments. And if we look at the types of targets that were defined by countries, and in particular of quantifiable targets, meaning targets that have a clear delivery date and a clear baseline, well, we found that 50% of the countries have a quantifiable food loss and waste target that's related to the retail and household stages, so the stages that are directly defined in the SDG 12.3, and only 11% have a target that's related to the agricultural production stage. We can move to the next slide. Yeah. So we were interested in looking at the alignment of country strategies with international guidelines. There are many international initiatives that aim at supporting national food loss and waste reduction ambition. And we found that countries rarely actively participate or apply the principles. For example, the FAO Voluntary Code of Conduct for Food Loss and Waste Reduction has developed a conceptual framework called the food waste hierarchy, the pyramid you're seeing here in this slide, that provides guidance on how different material streams can be handled. It proposed that actions to reduce food loss and waste should be prioritized according to the following orders: source reduction, food redistribution, animal feed, composting, industrial uses, and then incineration or landfill. Well, what we found is that in 50% of the cases, so 50% of the countries do not apply any type of such guidance to their food loss and waste strategy. So only, and the other half do have a guidance. And only about 25% of the countries, so 1/4, have a guidance that's fully aligned with the FAO international guidance. Now let's look at the common characteristics of national food loss and waste strategy. So we got a lot of information, and we could see 4 main aspects to these strategies. The first one is that they are all influenced by national conditions based on, geographical, economic, legislative, or social aspects. The second point is that quite often the targets that underlie the strategies are not clearly defined. In most of the countries, baseline year are not set, meaning you don't know. So countries are set to reduce food loss and waste, but we don't know compared to what and when. And in the fourth of the countries, the target horizon is not set either. So targets are not clearly defined. Then we saw that multiple policy instruments are being used, up to 5 policy instruments in most of the countries. And this is for sure posing some governance challenges. In addition, we have a quasi absence of ex ante and ex post impact assessments. So countries are not doing any evaluations ex ante or ex post of their policy initiatives. The fourth point I want to show today is that there are very few mechanisms for stakeholder engagement. So we have the countries we have with us today have some mechanisms for stakeholder engagement, but in most of the countries we didn't see them. So it seems that it's difficult for the stakeholders to commit to reduction targets without mechanism for being part of the policy process. So if we look if we deep dive into the policy instruments that are being used, so the first point I want to make now is that the level of policy attention varies across stages. In about a third of the countries, the policy instruments that are set are not tailored to any agro-food supply chain. Then if we look specifically at the stages that are covered by food loss and waste policy instruments, we see that the retail and the household stages receive the most attention, with about 80% of the countries having at least one policy instrument to address food loss and waste reduction. And then on the other end, some agro-food supply chain stages receive very little attention. Only half of the countries have a policy instrument that's related to public food procurement, 60% to the on-farm production stage, and 56% to the wholesale stage. We looked at the different types of policy instruments that are being implemented, and we had some specific questions about that. We found that countries mobilize a wide range of policy instruments. They implement more frequently what you see on the left of this slide, so soft policy measures, such as awareness raising, an educational campaign, and voluntary collaboration with the industry. Mandatory regulations and fiscal measures are less commonly used. We don't have time now to look more deeply into the policy instruments that are being implemented on a country basis. But I invite you to look at our website and at the paper, where you will find some specific information about the policy tools being used. In particular, on the website, you can just try and look interactively at the different stages and look at the type of policy instruments that are being used in the different countries. We will hear more from the 3 countries around the table about specific policy action. So I will stop there with this and move to the final slide, which is about the key policy insights from this work. And so we have 3 main policy recommendations based on this stock-taking exercise. The first one is that countries could strengthen their policy ambition. How can they do that? Well, they can set clear, quantifiable targets with defined baseline and delivery dates. They can also promote stakeholder engagement so that food loss and waste reduction is seen as a win-win initiative, not just something to tick a box and stick to SDG 12.3. Second point, very, very, very important, is that countries need to establish regular monitoring and evaluation mechanism for food loss and waste policies. They need to assess the actual impact on food loss and waste reduction, but they also need to look into the economic, social, and environmental outcomes. Well, it will be interesting and useful to gather information on the cost effectiveness of food loss and waste policy instruments. And we'll hear from the three countries around the table on that. Final point, we think that it's very important for countries to enhance and foster international cooperation. There is a lot to learn from policy action across the globe to encourage good policy practices and shared learnings. And this is why we're gathered today, and we hope that this conversation will continue after this event. I will stop here and want to thank you all for your kind attention. Don't hesitate to reach out after this event. And I will now pass the floor to Cécile Haverkamp, who will lead the expert discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Céline, and good morning, good afternoon, and maybe for some of you already evening. Thank you for this very rich presentation of the background and the main areas of findings of this first ever policy review that you and your team have undertaken. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me personally and for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network to be working with the OECD team, and for me now to moderate the following discussion. I think just looking at the comments that have come in, I want to point out that the team at the OECD has established a dedicated website to food loss and waste. So if you're looking for background information, the actual report and the case studies, please go to that website. We at the SDSN, our purpose is to really mobilize science and policy practice networks in support of the SDGs. And from our perspective on the SDGs, as mentioned by Céline and before her by Julia, food loss and waste is really a critical area for policy action. It not only is important for food systems and the way they operate and in the context of increasing food insecurity, but action on food loss and waste also has important impact, positive impact, and to address the climate and nature crises. In that context, we are very much involved in the food loss and waste space, tracking action, government action, and we are also doing so in the context of the Food and Land Use Coalition and a new initiative called the Global Action Drive to Reduce Food Loss and Waste. But with that said, I'm now very happy to turn the following segment of this webinar to countries and to have conversations and presentations by and with the experts we have from the countries, from Australia, from France, and from Japan. We will ask them to give us a brief overviews of their work and their perspective, first starting with Steve Lepage, who is the CEO of End Food Waste Australia, followed by Maïwen Loire from the French Ministry of Agriculture, Food Sovereignty, Forest, again in France. And then finally from Makoto Tanaka from the Japanese Consumer Affairs Agency. We're very happy that they are able to join us and to really help us focus on where the action ultimately needs to happen, namely in countries. So Steve, just to introduce Steve to you, Steve is the creator and CEO of End Food Waste Australia, Australia's national public-private partnership delivering on SDG 12.3. His career has focused on industry-based science and commercialization across the wildlife, agri-food, and sustainability fields, and he has deep expertise and experience in this space. So we really look forward to his presentation. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Cecil. If I can have my first slide, please. I'd like to start by thanking the OECD for the opportunity to present today and for contributing to the report and being chosen as one of the case study countries. It's a great honour. Next slide, please. So Australia's food waste journey, before we go there, for those that have not heard about End Food Waste Australia, you may have heard of the Fight Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre, as that's where we started life in 2018. We've had a very different journey in Australia regarding food waste. I often say we're late to the party, but we've been trying to catch up fast. And we started with an industry and state government collaboration or public-private partnership, which we then were able to attract federal government funding to. That was later renamed the End Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre. It was our core pillar and our foundation for the rest of the organisation. We then built on different programs over the subsequent years. So in 2021, we built on what was called Stop Food Waste Australia for a while, but it consists of the Australian Food Pact, our voluntary agreement, and sector action plans with our main commodities. In 2022, we built on again with a more greater focus on policy and partnerships, and I'll touch on some of the work in that area. And most recently, in 2023, we launched our nationwide consumer behaviour change campaign called The Great Unwaste. And if you haven't seen that on social media or on its website, then I highly encourage you to go and take a look at that. In terms of the model that we have in Australia, we're probably most similar to the Netherlands and Food Waste Free United, and that was a remark in the report. Next slide, please. So Australia's national journey regarding food waste really commenced in 2015. While there was individual company activity and state-based activity before then, there was no real national movement. So following the commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, there was the creation of the National Food Waste Strategy in 2017, and this remains one of our key policy instruments for Australia achieving 50% food waste reduction by 2030. Australia chose the hard path, if you like. We chose to reduce all food loss and waste from primary production to consumer, including edible and inedible parts. So we have our work cut out for us in this country. In terms of the National Food Waste Strategy, there's 4 key pillars or priority areas that you can see here: policy support, business improvements, market development, and behaviour change. There's quite small text on there, so I certainly don't see that you'll read it, but fair to say that we've recently restructured the organisation around these 4 key priority areas, and that's what we're delivering on. And many of these focus areas or deliverables have now been delivered or in the process of being delivered. Next slide, please. The other key policy instruments around Australia's food waste journey was the 2019 National Waste Policy Action Plan, and then that was subsequently updated in 2022, which is the one you see here. It has 2 main targets: reduce total waste generated in Australia by 10% per person by 2030, and this is all forms of waste. And target 6 is to halve the amount of organic waste sent to landfill for disposal by 2030. Within the action plan, there are a number of specific actions that relate to food waste reduction, and you can see them here. They relate to the creation of a voluntary commitment, now called the Australian Food Pact, the creation and publication of a National Food Waste Implementation Plan, which I'll touch on in a minute, support for national campaigns, behaviour change campaigns targeted at consumers, the alignment of community education efforts to reduce food waste, as we have our 7 states and territories and our federal government, and for some time they were running different programs, and we're trying to get that alignment, and also to support the research and development sector, the Fight Food Waste CRC, to help industry find what we often say is find the carrots rather than coming in with a stick. And that's been very much Australia's approach so far with industry, looking for those carrots to support them to create wealth as well as find innovative solutions to food waste. Next slide, please. So in terms of food waste in Australia, we did an initial food waste baseline in 2019 that was subsequently updated in 2021, and the current volume is 7.6 million tonnes. And the economic costs related to that, it doesn't include the social costs or the environmental costs, is 36.6 billion Australian dollars, which equates to about 22 billion euro. So a substantial amount. I won't go into the other figures here, except to say that the total contribution of food waste to Australia's greenhouse gas emissions is about 3.5%, which is low compared to the global average, which is closer to 10%, but that's because we have higher emissions in some other areas related to power generation and agriculture. Next slide, please. So in 2020, the process started to develop a national food waste strategy roadmap. And then in 2021, there was a subsequent study done to update the baseline and also look at whether halving food waste in Australia was feasible. The conclusion from that study was that yes, it is feasible, but it would take an unprecedented effort to halve food waste by 2030, particularly considering, as I said before, Australia was quite late in coming to the party. In terms of all the different activities here, which I'm sure you can't read, it is fair to say that we are behind schedule and we still need to accelerate our efforts if we are going to halve food waste by 2030. Next slide, please. A couple of years ago, we also did a food waste policy workshop to look at the key areas that we need to innovate in terms of food waste policy in Australia. The 5 priority areas that came out of that workshop were around consumer behaviour change, and of course we've launched our campaign since then. Food waste to animal feed regulation and legislation, which we have done some work in already and keen to do more. Unfair trading practices and whole crop purchase agreements, particularly with the retail sector, mandatory food waste reduction targets, and measurement of food waste and loss. And these are key themes you also find through the OECD report. Next slide, please. One thing that has really helped us create momentum and keep that momentum over recent years is a series of national food waste summits. The first was for the launch of the National Food Waste Strategy in 2017, and then we've held subsequent summits in 2022 and 2024. The last one in Melbourne attracted about 350 people to that event. So they are significant events, and we provide updates on how Australia is tracking as a country at those events, as well as innovations in the field. Next slide, please. So to finish with, we recently launched a 2024 to 2030 strategic business plan at the last Food Waste Summit. It outlines where Australia is at as a country in terms of our food waste journey. We believe on our current efforts, we'll achieve about a 31% reduction against the National Food Waste Strategy target by 2030. And we're hoping with additional investment, we will be able to achieve at least 85% of the target. And we are looking for other partners and related activities to achieve the other 15%. So certainly as a country, we are still hopeful to achieving the SDG 12.3. We certainly recognise that the clock is ticking. I will leave it there. There is one more slide just with my contact details. I do know the slides will be circulated. Please get in contact with me if you've got any questions. Back to you, Cecil. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for that very rich set of insights into the work in Australia. And as you pointed out, even though there's so many activities and the commitment has been strong since the SDGs, that itself does not guarantee that the kind of impact on the data can be seen, and there is a delay there. Thank you so much. Very interesting. We're moving to our next speaker from France, Maïwen Loire, who is in charge of the fight against food waste and food insecurity, as well as sustainable food at the Directorate General for Food at the French Ministry of Agriculture and Food Sovereignty. Very happy to have her, and she has a background as an agronomic engineer specializing in environment, so just exactly the qualification that this seems to require. Over to you, Maïwen.
Thank you, Cecil. Thank you, everyone. Good morning to everyone. So I'm really also happy to be here. So I would like to, as mentioned before by Céline, food waste is an economic, social and ecological nonsense, and the challenge of reducing food waste is more than ever at the top of our concerns. The French government mobilized very early on, more precisely in 2013, on the issue of food waste. France has committed itself to the ambition, and it is now set out in law. It's about halving food waste by 2025 for the retail and the collective catering sectors, and by 2030 for the other sectors. The resulting ambitious national policy to fight against food waste is based on 3 levels. The first one is the introduction of incentive measures. The second one is the deployment of a legislative framework. And the third one is the leverage of territories. Next slide, please. So now I would like to present you the incentive measures taken by France. So the fight against food waste is a priority for France's food policy as set out in the National Food Programme. This program sets out the objectives of French food policy. It has 3 strategic axes: social justice, food education, and the fight against food waste. And this program is based on a national call for projects, which is a concrete incentive tool for implementing food policy in France. France has also worked to clarify consumption dates. So several factors can explain households' food waste, such as the misunderstanding of consumption dates, in particular the best before dates, which are often confused with use by dates. In order to solve this issue, French law provides for additional information to be added to the best before dates. France has also set up a national label to fight against food waste. The aim of this label is to reward all actors in the food chain who contribute to reduce food waste in France. The targeted actors are distributors, collective and commercial catering, but also agri-food industries and primary production. This label is based on a reference framework of means and results. It is co-constructed with all the stakeholders of the food chain, and it enables to provide definitions and means of measuring food waste. And the accompanying control plan covers the procedures for certification by the certification bodies and for monitoring the label. The label can be obtained with 3 levels of progression to reward efforts already made, but also to encourage players to improve, and that is to say, to reach the best level, the level 3. The system will help to guide consumer choices and create a virtuous dynamic for all the actors of the food chain. So next slide, please. Yes. So in addition to having put in place an incentive framework to fight against food waste, France is also known for having put in place a national of legislation. So France has been gradually implementing an ambitious legislative framework since 2016. And France has now a robust legislation in that matter. It initially applied to distribution, and it has then been extended to collective catering, food processing industries, but also wholesalers. So now I would like to talk about general framework of legislation. So the law precises a hierarchy of actions to fight against food waste, as mentioned just Celine before. The law prohibits the practice of destroying food that is still edible for consumption for distributors, collective catering, and the agri-food industry. We can also quote the obligation to carry out a food waste diagnosis. This is available for the collective catering sector, but also the agri-food industry sector. France has also a peculiar legislation concerning food donation. There is the compulsory proposal of a donation agreement to food aid association for the big economic players that are targeted by legislation. This is the case for big distributors, collective catering operators, but also for the agri-food industry and food wholesalers operators. There is also the tax reduction that is possible for the food donation products. Food donated products are also exempted from VAT. So this is an important lever to accelerate food donation, which is a lever to fight against food waste. And finally, next slide, please. I would like also to quote a measure concerning commercial catering sector. So the law introduces the obligation for the sector to offer a recyclable or reusable container to take away uneaten food. So this is the equivalent of doggy bag that you may know. And next slide, please. Now I would like to talk a little about the territorial approach policy taken by France. So you are well aware of the importance of leveraging the territories. And in this regard, France has adopted this approach by introducing an innovative tool. This is called the Territorial Food Project, so Projets Alimentaires Territoriaux in French. This project enabled to bring closer together the various stakeholders in a given territory around the issue of food. These projects play an essential role in accelerating the agricultural and food transition. There are currently in France more than 454 projects in France, so they show that this is important in France. And the law stipulates that these projects must aim to fight against food waste, adopting a systemic approach. In France, we have also a network that are 100% dedicated to fight against food waste. These networks are called REGAL. Next slide, please. So finally, I would also speak about the fact that as a member state of the European Union, France's policy to fight against food waste is closely linked to the European policy in the matter, which has intensified since 2022. Indeed, the European Commission introduced mandatory reporting of food waste levels to member states. And on the 5th July, the Commission published a legislative proposal to revise the Waste Framework Directive, setting legally binding food waste reduction targets for member states. So the trilogue stage is currently underway. Just one minute. I would like to talk about, yes, next slide, that you are right. I would like to talk about the perspective from France. So we are currently elaborating a new national strategy for food, nutrition, and climate with all the ministries concerned, and it aims to establish the roadmap for food policy up to 2030. And fortunately, obviously, the fight against food waste will play a key role in this strategy. So I finished. Thank you.
Thank you, Mai Wen, for this excellent overview and for the reflection of France's policy landscape and experience and even outlook at the end. Very different from a policy point of view, but clearly France has been a champion over the past decade and more. If I may also add to what you said, for this audience, France will also host the Nutrition for Growth Summit in March, one of the key events on this year's calendar, making the link between nutrition, food, climate, and nature action. So again, something for the delegations, especially in Paris. Thank you so much. Very happy to turn over to our third country expert speaker, to Makoto Tanaka from the Japanese Consumers Affairs Agency, where he is the head of the government's command center office in charge of the Act on Promotion of Food Loss and Waste Reduction. His role there is to promote public understanding of food loss and waste reduction and to achieve the reduction targets set by government through the implementation of concrete measures in cooperation with relevant other ministries and private actors. It's a pleasure to have you, Makoto, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. First, let me talk about the key points of FLW reduction policies in Japan. In 2000, Japan quantified FLW for the first time. The study found that large amounts of FLW were generated by a variety of factors, including business practices such as excess inventory and returns that are indirectly caused by consumers' excessive preference for freshness. Subsequently, in 2019, the Act on Promotion of FLW Reduction was enacted in response to SDG target 12.3, adopted in 2015. The enactment of this law strengthened FLW reduction measures in the Japanese government. Policies on FLW reduction in Japan are implemented by multiple government agencies. Each agency has its own policy for each stage of the food supply chain, while cooperating on some policies. As part of the policy evaluation, public opinion surveys on changes in consumer awareness and behavior toward FLW are conducted every year. The percentage of consumers who are aware of the FLW problem and are taking actions to reduce FLW has reached approximately 75% as of 2024. The government aims to increase this rate to 80%. Next slide, please. The FLW Reduction Act, enacted in 2019, requires various actors, such as the national government, local governments, businesses, and consumers to work together to promote the reduction of FLW as a national movement. In addition, this act requires the national government and the local governments to make basic policies for promoting the reduction of FLW. Next slide, please. The current basic policy was approved by the Cabinet in 2020. This basic policy outlines the actions and the laws expected of the national and the local governments, businesses, and the consumers in promoting the reduction of FLW. In addition, current basic policy is currently under review as it will be in place for 5 years this year. The Japanese government is planning to work on reducing FLW based on the new basic policy from FY 2025 to FY 2030. Next slide, please. In response to SDG target 12.3, the current basic policy sets a goal of having both commercial and household FLW by FY 2030, starting with FY 2000 figure of 9.8 million tons. Next slide, please. This is a graph showing the annual changes in the amount of FLW in Japan. The latest figures are estimated values for FY 2022. In FY 2022, the amount of FLW from both commercial and household sources is 2.36 million tons. Regarding the target of having FLW by FY 2030, commercial sources have achieved this goal 8 years ahead of schedule, while households still need to reduce FLW by another 0.2 million tons to reach the target. Next slide, please. This graph shows the causes of FLW generation from businesses and households. The further reduce FLW, we believe it is necessary to strongly urge businesses to review their distribution practices and to change consumer behavior. Next slide, please. In Japan, estimates have been published converting the amount of FLW into economic losses and greenhouse gas emissions to show that FLW has a significant impact both economically and environmentally. The estimated economic loss in Japan, calculated from the 4.72 million tons of FLW in FY 2022, is approximately 4 trillion yen. In addition, the estimated greenhouse gas emissions converted into this amount is as high as 10.46 million tons of CO2. Next slide, please. Finally, in December 2023, the Consumer Affairs Agency and other relevant ministries and agencies compiled a policy package to ensure that the target of having FLW by FY 2030 is achieved. This policy package lists 3 key measures. First, promoting food donations. Second, promoting doggy bags. Third, promoting fundamental reductions in the generation of food waste, such as reviewing delivery deadlines for food businesses, promoting food reuse, extending expiration dates, and using ICT to forecast demand. These measures are scheduled to be reflected in the new basic policy to start in FY 2025. This concludes the current situation regarding FAW in Japan. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And your data and your presentation clearly illustrate that dedication and coherent policy follow-up has the potential to concretely reduce the numbers and the volume of food loss and food waste. Congratulations for the achievements you made, and I think we all hope that you will not stop there, but that you will maybe on the next possible occasion increase the ambition of your strategy. And as we all know, this is a big year for climate action with COP30 looming at the end of the year. All countries have the opportunity to need to present new nationally determined contribution as soon as possible. And so there is a great hope that a lot of countries will take this opportunity to include very specific national targets for food loss and food waste. So thank you for your presentation. Some of the audience members have started sending us questions, and while the team is reviewing them, I have very quick, rapid follow-up questions to all three experts regarding some of the key recommendations that were in the report. If I may start with Steve, there is a strong recommendation for the value of inclusive and transparent policy dialogue, and especially between public and private sectors and partnerships. Steve, could you tell us what the experience was in Australia and why this mattered a lot to making progress on the ground?
Yes, certainly, Cecil. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, we started with a quite large public-private partnership, over 60 participants, and that really created a very strong foundation from which to have those further conversations around policy intervention and mapping a future of halving food waste by 2030. It wasn't until 2021 that we actually took on the delivery of the National Food Waste Strategy. So we started as an R&D organisation, and because of our foundation, we could then take on the strategy. Most other countries, start the other way around. So it's been a unique approach.
Very interesting. Thank you. Another key recommendation from the report was the importance of measuring and evaluating kind of continuously and have that drive the action. In Japan, there is specific experience with that. If I could ask Makoto for a quick reflection on the importance of that in the Japanese experience.
Yeah, thank you for your question. First, I think it is great that the OECD report includes information on improving FAW measurement and evaluation practices. So in Japan, the food waste recycling law was enacted in 2000, which requires food businesses to report food to the government. This makes it possible to estimate the amount of commercial FLW by reporting the amount of commercial food waste. For households, a system has been established to measure FLW from households along with the amount of general waste, with the cooperation of approximately 200 local governments nationwide. As a result, FLW has been estimated each year while keeping a national budget cost down. So, however, because measuring only the amount of FLW is insufficient to evaluate the economic and the social impact of FLW, last year, for the first time, the government published a figure converting the amount of FLW into economic loss and greenhouse gas emissions. This has raised interest among the public and many in the media about the economic and the social impacts of FLW. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important point. Not just counting the tons, but also counting the money and obviously the impact on climate and nature. Thank you so much. And third one, a recommendation from the report regarding international cooperation. I think, Maïwenn, you already touched on this, but specifically, what was the French experience and what would you reflect on this?
Yeah, so France believes strongly in the sharing of experience and in collaboration, as we are convinced that countries have a lot to learn from each other. Today, the OECD have showed that we have a great lot to learn from the Japanese and Australian experience in the matter, which is very inspiring for France. I have in mind the household survey conducted by Japan, but also its interesting basic measures by the central government. And the amazing strategy from Australia with its 5 priorities, including consumer behavior change campaigns, food waste to animal feed regulation and legislation, but also the unfair trading practice and the world crop purchase agreements. In this respect, France has welcomed international delegations from all over the world to share its experience in the matter, including Georgia, Switzerland, Canada, the Netherlands, and the United Arab Emirates, for example. France was also very happy to share its experience with Japan because Japan came to France last year. And I remember well our common webinar with Australia and with Steve. It was also last year. So as said before, as a member state of the European Union, France participates also to the European platform of food loss and waste, which enables to share information and best practice with other member states of the European Union. As I mentioned, the fight against food waste is a process of continuous improvements, and cooperation enables to improve collectively because it's a fight that concerns all of us. In line with this idea of continuous improvement, the question of evaluating our policy is very important, and France is actively working to optimize and to improve the evaluation of its policy by improving also its indicators. So I totally agree with what Celine said during our presentation.
Thank you so much. And of course, this webinar is hosted by the OECD, and the idea of international collaboration around technical issues, around shared challenges, is at the core of the OECD's mission. And especially this dialogue on policy and to learn together about what works and how does it work and how can everybody benefit from that learning curve is something that is really critical to making progress across economies and across countries. Thank you so much. And you've noticed that we have a very busy live chat to this discussion on the side. Just to assure you, this is all captured and the team is taking all of this on board. There are several questions kind of in clusters that address similar aspects. So with that, I would like to maybe open the floor to more questions from the audience, but already starting with a first one around the role of monitoring and impact assessment. So there's several questions around the question of gaps, and you noticed from Celine's presentation, this analysis was very much based on identifying and specifying what these gaps are as a very practical way of closing them. So the gaps between especially the ambitious policy goals and the measures for monitoring and assessing the impacts, where do these gaps come from? Do they have to do with maybe a lack of suitable indicators, or there are other factors that explain these gaps? So maybe we take this one first, and looking at our 3 panelists, who would like to speak about this? Anyone? Maybe Makoto, it relinks maybe to what is quite a rigorous approach that you shared with us in Japan, really being driven by data and having a very sophisticated approach to monitoring impact, not just the numbers. Could I ask you maybe to quickly, have you looked at the gaps and how do you explain the remaining gaps? Thank you. And maybe for explanation to the audience, we're working with an interpreter here, so there is a little delay, but I'm sure his answer will be a very interesting one. Maybe while that is happening, let me put another question out there for the other panelists to come right after. A question regarding food industry and how, especially in Japan again, but also in other countries, how to close the gap in implementation. Thank you. Makoto, over to you.
So Mr. Tanaka has responded that in Japan, we do gather the data from all of the restaurants owners and try to identify the edible food out of what they provide to us. Also, for those restaurant owners, for example, business owners who have more than 100 tons of the food waste, and they are obliged to report to the Japanese government to us. So our data is very precise and accurate. And in our understanding, when it comes to the household waste food loss, we do sample them and we do open up their household garbage to see if there are edible food remaining. So again, our indicators are very accurate.
Thank you very much. It shows again, if you don't understand your data, you cannot really inform your actions. What you seem to say is that you have developed a system where you have a good sense of what is happening, and that allows you to really respond in a very targeted way. Maiwen, your hand is up, please.
Yeah, just maybe to complete this question, France, as you may know, is a member of the European Union, and we are somewhere lucky because it's mandatory for us, as for all of the other member states, to monitor our levels of food waste levels. So the European Union has introduced mandatory reporting of food waste for every member state, and the measurement methodology and data communication format have to be transmitted by member states, and they are set out in 2 Commission decisions. So we have to measure according a certain methodology and according a certain format of communication. So that's for the European part.
Thank you for adding that, Maiwen. Another question that we've received from the chat and from some of the participants relates to public behavior change campaigns, and many countries are considering them as part of their instrumentarium for addressing this. What is learned, and what are the takeaways? What is the emerging good or even best practice? So maybe to our speakers, what's the experience in Australia, for example, with regards to public behavior change campaigns, how to do them? Again, every country and every people are different, but maybe there's a lot of learning involved in understanding what other countries have done and are doing.
And if I may say so, I mean, I think that's a very important point. No 2 countries are the same, and what works in one country may not work in another, particularly, one with quite a different culture. There are some excellent behaviour change campaigns out there already, but the Australian government and our own research indicated that we should be producing something in Australia that very targets our culture and our drivers. Food is relatively cheap in Australia, and so focusing on the cost or cost loss from food waste may not be the driver that people need, and you might need an environmental driver or a social driver. So that's where we've started our research from 4 years ago, and the campaign is what's come out of that. But it is based on 4 years of evidence from a very large data set collected under a project called the Household Intervention Project. But please check out the Great Unwaste campaign. I think it is a very innovative and really visually itchy campaign.
Thank you so much. My win, I'm sure there's also experience from France related to this. And after that, Makoto from Japan, another perspective. And as Steve said, that gives us different kind of responses in different cultural and economic contexts. That's wonderful. My win.
Yeah, just to precise the fact that France has already made several campaigns, but I have to recognize the fact that France is not perfect, because we have a lot to learn from Australia, but also from the Netherlands. These countries did amazing campaigns. In France, we have to improve ourselves, because we have to learn and to study what can explain the food waste generated by consumers or the other member of the food chains. So we do still improve our knowledge about that in order to improve ourselves to make more effective campaigns, because an agency of France conduces today a study to improve the knowledge about what explains food waste by consumers. So I recognize that we are not perfect in this area.
And nobody is, of course. Makoto, please. Waiting for the interpretation.
So for Japan, we do, as I have indicated earlier, about disclosing the volume of the food loss and waste, and also to take into consideration of the economic loss and the environmental burden. So we have been putting much effort in addressing the situation in Japan.
Thank you for that. Very helpful as well. You have all seen how there's so many more questions and so many more comments in our chat here. We unfortunately are running out of time. But just to assure you again, we will pass these questions not only to our panelists, but the OECD team takes very careful note. I also want to specifically point out that we got a lot of questions, just as we got a lot of participants from countries outside of the OECD membership, especially from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from India, and so on. And that kind of course, speaks to the global dimension of the challenges and the fact that policy dialogue and that learning that can be done together is not something that is limited to the OECD only. And the OECD has a very important role in helping everyone to really become as practical and as effective in addressing these challenges together. So again, if your question didn't make it into this short segment, then don't despair. We will follow up, and I point you again to the main report, to the 3 case studies, and to the new website section on the OECD website. And with that, I would like to very much thank everyone and hand over to Leanne Jackson, who is the director of the OECD Trade and Agricultural Directorate, for her closing. It has been her team and under her directorship that all of this work, starting with the design of the original questionnaire, has started. And I'm sure she's very happy with how the discussion went and is going to tell us also how this is going to move forward. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Cecil. You actually gave me a promotion. I'm the head of the division that's called the Agro-Food Trade and Markets Division within the Trade and Agriculture Directorate. But
you're welcome.
Exactly. I'll follow up with you later. So thanks everyone for participating. We had a great turnout today, and people stayed online listening, I think, very deeply, as we could see from the chat on the side. What I heard were a lot of comments around learning, which I think is like a really critical thing that we need to keep in mind, because we're talking about a big systems change that we started paying attention to globally 10 or 15, maybe 20 years ago, but the system's been in place for quite some time. So we need to really take advantage of these opportunities to learn from each other. And I heard lots of great kind of granular information from the case studies about the measurement challenges and how measurement is informing the national learning about what's working in the country, but then also hearing from the case studies about learning from other countries, which I think is really important. We had some comments around incentives. So when we're thinking about systems, of course, we need to make sure that the incentives are pulling in the right direction. And we had some comments around carrots to try to incentivize the positive behavior. I think paying attention to that is going to be really important going forward. And then the process, obviously, lots of comments around the importance of the public sector working closely with the private sector, the importance of ministries working together within national governments, and also thinking about how consumers are actually part of the solution. So lots of really good learnings from today. And I think that the event has already sort of pointed us in some directions for where we're going to take our future work. So people have already mentioned the web page. I'll mention it one last time. We have a dedicated food loss and waste web page where you can find our report. There's also a nice interactive tool on there that can show differences across the different countries that were included within the report. And we'll post the recording of this webinar there too, so you'll be able to get all that information. So what our report really focused on, besides shining a light and developing really the first ever evidence base of what policy actions are being taken, but it also highlighted where some of the challenges are, and we've heard that in these discussions. So challenges when we look at how many of the countries that were within this report are actually setting clear targets. So we need more effort around having clear targets, also more effort around having coherent commitments, because we see lots of sort of fragmented commitments within national governments. So having a coherent approach to commitments for food loss and waste. And then this issue again around coordination, because we need the machine of government to be moving in the same direction. We also had lots of good examples, like I said, about this stakeholder engagement. So at the OECD, we're entering in a new phase of research, and we will continue working on food loss and waste. And the idea for the next couple of years is to be digging even more into these questions on what do we know about measurement? How can we refine the way we're measuring in order to help the learning process and move us more quickly towards our food loss and waste goals, meeting these goals. So before we close out, it's my pleasure to give a round of thank yous to everyone who made this webinar possible. So I'd like to thank Olivia Dubois. I'd like to thank other people in the room with me, Barbara Gilbert, Armel Elazri, Juan David Sainz, and our team behind the curtain running the event, as well as our communications team, Caitlin Burrows, Sydney Scott, and Mark Rainier. So can I encourage everyone who's online with us also to fill in the online questionnaire? Like I said, we'll be sharing through a follow-up email presentations and relevant research that's related to this webinar. So I'll pause for a second to see if there's something else to add. No? Okay. Oh, good. So the poll, I guess, is available to everyone who's still online. So if you could just take a second It should just take less than a minute to fill in. This helps us a lot when we think about how to plan our next webinars. This is live now. Okay. Great. Thanks everyone who's putting their responses in. So we'll give this a minute before we close out. I should also give a big thank you to the panelists and Cecil for running that really interesting discussion. It's helping us, like I said, to plan for our next steps. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
So.
Bye-bye.
Let's take a screenshot.
A screenshot.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.